In this lesson, we're going to take our list data, which we're currently displaying inside of our React component, and we're going to transform that into something truly different. We're going to be utilizing a library called Chart.js. You can check this out at Chart.js.org or follow the link in the video description down below. And this is a really great charting library that allows developers to simply plug in a JSON object into the Chart.js library, and it does a lot of really cool things, including charts such as line charts, as you can see here, bar charts, etc. There's just a whole ton of options, and the great thing about it is it's kind of just plug and play. You drop in some data, it does its thing, it figures out all the very difficult things that would normally be involved in charting your data, and it just kind of does that for you. Chart.js has absolutely nothing to do with SharePoint framework, so this is also a great opportunity to show how we can import any external NPM package, drop it into our SharePoint framework solution, and start to utilize that to do just about anything we can think of. In addition to base Chart.js, there's also a really great React version of this library that is going to implement really well with our React components and just make this a breeze to use. So let's go ahead and add this now. We're going to jump back into our terminal. I'm going to hit Control-C to stop our Gulp dev server. And we're going to use the npm install command to install two packages that we're going to need to utilize that Chart.js library. That's going to be Chart.js itself, as well as the React version of that, of the React library for this, which is called React Chart.js 2. And we need to make sure we use the -- save flag to indicate these are going to be dependencies that are saved to our package JSON file. This is going to take just a moment to install, so we'll give that just a second, and we'll be right back. Okay, now that that is done, let's go ahead and run gulp serve once again to start our local workbench back up. And I'm going to close the old local workbench and just drag this back over, and we'll add our -web part back to the page. So let's take a look at this library that we just imported and see how that's going to work. We're going to do this in our chart React component that we have open here. And in this file, we are going to import. That's going to be import bar from React Chart.js 2. And now that this is imported, we can drop this into our render method down here. Let's drop this maybe right below our error state. And we're just going to add bar. And this is going to take a single prop called data that we need to provide to it. And that is basically a JSON object that describes what is the data that we actually want to display inside of this bar chart. And you can read all about this in the Chart.js documentation and on Chart.js.org. And the truth is there's quite a few ways you can configure Chart.js. It's really quite an extensible library, and there's so many options that we couldn't possibly cover all of them now. But to get you started, we'll drop in some dummy data here just to kind of see how it works. And then we'll talk about the best way to implement this into our SharePoint data that we're also retrieving in this component. And this data object that we're passing as a prop down to this component requires a couple of things. First of all, we need an array of labels. And you can kind of think of the labels as the x-axis labels on this bar chart. So maybe we want to record some data for January, February, and March, for example. And then in addition, you also need an array of data sets. And each data set is going to kind of correspond to the labels up above, but they're defining what the series of data are inside of this bar chart. So for example, we could have a data set for apples. Maybe we want to track how many apples we sold in these 3 months, January through March. And to do that, we add a data array to this data set, and then it needs to contain 3 values, one for January, one for February, and one for March. So let's just put in some random values here for that data. And then all we have to do is kind of duplicate this for as many series of data that we may have. So maybe we're going to have some oranges and some bananas. And let's put in some random numbers here real quick. And if we give that a save, you'll notice over in our local workbench That's all we had to do to create a really quite nice, engaging chart. We haven't provided any colors or anything yet, so it's all looking very monotone at this point, but it took care of doing a lot of stuff that would normally have been really difficult for us to do. For example, it's automatically choosing the range of our y-axis based on the maximum and minimum values that we've provided in our data sets. It's automatically grouped these bar charts into these three groups along the x-axis, January, February, and March. And you even get these nice tooltips where you can hover over and see we sold 13 bananas in March. And this is pretty cool because it was so easy to drop into this solution. And not only that, but the way we're describing our data is through a JSON object. And that's a really cool opportunity because we also have another JSON object in this component, which is the JSON that comes back from our web services. So eventually what we can do is we can just take this data that we have in our web services and plug it in to Chart.js and have it chart our list items for us. Before we do that, let's add a couple of things to here that we should be aware of. First of all, we have a color that we can add to each of these data sets. And that's generally something you're going to want to do. You don't want to accept this default light gray color. So let's go to each of these data sets here. And I'm going to set up some multiple cursors. And we're going to add background color, which is going to be an RGBA value of, we'll just start with black. And that'll be 0.1 in opacity. And then we'll also add a border color, which will be also an RGBA value of 000 and then 1. And then we'll just change the red value of our apples to 255. We'll change the green value of our oranges to 255, and we'll change the blue value of our bananas to 255. And then by saving that again in our local workbench, you'll see we're going to get a color for each of those data sets, both in the legend up above and down in the chart itself. We could probably bump this up from 0.1 to 0.5, so that's a little bit easier to see. But as you can see, you have really fine-tuned control over your colors, which looks very nice. Another really cool thing about this library is it's not just bar charts. There's all kinds of stuff that you can actually do and import from this library. So let's jump up to the top at our import, and let's change this to both a bar chart as well as a line chart out of this React Chart.js 2 library. And all we have to do to switch this to a line chart is simply replace that component with a line component, and you'll see just how easy that was. As our local workbench refreshes, it's automatically going to plot all the data in our data sets, and it even adds some Bezier curves to kind of smooth out the curves for the data that you see in the chart. Very cool. So just a couple others that you may want to play around with when you're working with here. There is a horizontal bar chart that you can utilize. So that's just changing the orientation of the bar chart. And as you'll see here, it's basically the same thing, just a little bit of a different format. And depending on your data, that might be a nice way to go. And you also have lots of other chart types like a pie chart, a polar chart, a radar chart, and in this case, we'll do a donut chart as well. Now, we don't need to look at examples of all these. I'm just kind of showing you what you have. You can check out the documentation on chartjs.org. You can see all the different options here. I will mention that in some cases, to get the chart to display correctly, you may actually have to change the format of your data. For example, some of the chart types, like a bubble chart, actually take 3 axes of data. It has an X and a Y and then kind of a Z for the bubble size itself. So you could totally change the data that you have in the format of that JSON object based on what you're trying to display using Chart.js. For now, we'll kind of focus on line charts and bar charts because they're the easiest to use, in my opinion. It's just 2 axes of data, pretty easy to set up, but you're welcome to check out all the different options they have. They have quite a few that you can do. And again, it's all very extensible and very easy to customize to do whatever you want. So now the task becomes, how do we get our SharePoint data that we're retrieving from REST services, which is in a JSON format, how do we get that to be in the right format for Chart.js? And the answer to that is going to be, if you look down here in the format of this data object that we're passing to this horizontal bar chart in this instance, this JSON object has an array of labels, which correspond to the y-axis in this case on a horizontal bar, but on a regular bar chart, you'll see here, those labels become the x-axis. So we have January, February, March. And then each data set is just kind of going to be a color that's going to appear in that series. So honestly, the hardest part about data visualization is figuring out what it is you want to visualize. It's really not that difficult to take some data that you have in a table or whatever source of your data is, and then transform that so it can be visualized. The hard part is deciding what's on the x-axis, what's on the y-axis, what's a series and what's not. And that may seem obvious in some cases when you're looking at a chart, but when it comes down to it, when you're looking at a set of data, it's not always that obvious to decide what we want to do. But in our case, we do know that we have a series of data that's going to have years, and then each year has quarterly revenue. If you remember looking at that lemonade stand earnings list, it is each row in that list is a year, and then it has columns within each year for quarterly revenue. And perhaps in this case, we can decide that we want each series. So instead of apples, oranges, and bananas, we want 2013, 2014, 2015, etc. So these are going to be the series of data. And then along our x-axis at the bottom will be the quarters. So we'll have quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, etc. And then the y-axis will actually be the revenue in each of those quarters. And I think that's going to be an appropriate way to go ahead and visualize this data, this sample data that we're working with, but it's going to change totally based on what it is you're trying to visualize. So that means if we decide that is the format we want to use, we need to set up our data object in a way that the labels are going to equal quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, etc. And then the data sets are basically going to be one data set for each row in our list, right? So we're going to have a data set for 2013 that's going to have the 4 quarters in its data array, and then etc. We're just going to have a data set for each one of these rows in our list. And we can accomplish this by creating a method within this component that'll basically transpose the tabular list data that we have now in the form of our state. We have items stored in the state of this component. We're going to transpose that from its current format into this format, something that the Chart.js library can understand. So let's do that now. Let's see what that looks like. Let's go down to the bottom here and we'll create a public chart data method, which will return an object. And we'll just use a generic to describe what's being returned from this. As far as I know, Chart.js doesn't have typings, and you could certainly create an interface that says this object is going to contain an array of labels and an array of data sets. But let's just focus on getting this working for now and see if we can make that happen. And what we'll do within this method is, first of all, we're going to have a data object that we're going to be exporting or returning from this method. So this is going to be the chart data. This is going to be the prop that we're passing down to that chart component. And as before, it's going to need an array of labels as well as an array of data sets. And then at the end of this method, we're simply going to return data so that it returns that object. Now we do know what our labels are going to be. They're going to be Q1, Q2, etc. So we can go ahead and put those in there. That's fairly easy. But then we want our data sets to actually be generated from these list items that are returned whenever we click refresh on this web part. So in order to do that, we basically need to set up an iterator that's going to go through and create a data set for each one of those items. So let's do that now. We'll come down here and we'll say add data sets, and we'll say this.state.items.map, and for each item in that state, we will set a new data set to a new object here. Create data set. And just as before, up above, each data set needs to contain a label, which is some kind of string, and a data array. So in this case, the label is going to be 2013, 2014, etc. And we know that that is in the column item.title because we were rendering that in our bulleted list before. And here in this strong tag, that's the item.title that's being rendered. And then as far as our data goes, this needs to be 4 values because we need to map it to Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4 and make sure that that has the same items in here. So that's going to be item.earnings Q1 through Q4. And those are just columns that exist on this list that also exist in our mock list item collection. So again, if you're working in your local workbench, you need to make sure that whatever columns you want to chart are actually going to be in your mock data as well. Because otherwise you're going to get a reference error because those columns may not exist. So you need to make sure they're in both your mock data and in the actual list that you're testing in your remote workbench. And with this set up, we can now take that data set and we can say data.datasets.push dataset. So for each item in our state, we're going to push a new data set that's going to have a label of that item's title, and it's going to have the 4 values as the earnings there. And at the end of this method, we'll return data. And that's all we have to do in this case. So let's take this method, chart data, and first of all, we are using the this keyword, so let's bind this up in our constructor. So let's go up to the top here and set this.chartData equals this.chartData.bind this. And then let's take this method and replace our hard-coded JSON right down here with this.chartData. So we'll call that just like so. And when we refresh, we're going to get an empty chart to begin with, but if we click on refresh, it will actually chart all the data. And in this case, that is the mock data. So you can see here's our series up here at the top, and then down here is our quarterly earnings for each of those years. Likewise, in our remote desktop, or remote workbench rather, we're going to give this a refresh. We click on refresh, and it's going to load actual SharePoint data into the chart, which is looking great. So we can probably get rid of this iterator now. We don't actually want to do that. So let's go ahead and just delete the owner tag here, and we'll just leave our chart to leave a nice, simple web part in its wake. So again, I'll come down here and click on refresh. It's going to load that data in. And the coolest thing about this, in my opinion, is that this is now tied to real SharePoint data. So it's almost like we've created a backend, a place where we get all the great things that you get with SharePoint, where you can very easily edit items, add items, people can manage permissions on it, and control who has access to it. But now we have a view layer that's totally different from that boring tabular data that you have on the back end. And just as an example, I could come in to that list, which in this case is Lemonade Stand Earnings. Let's go to our site contents and open this list up. And let's just go ahead and add a new entry to this. So maybe it's 2019 and we're ready to have the values for that. Let's just add some dummy stuff in here and we will hit save. And as soon as we add this item, if I come back here and I click on refresh, you'll see it's going to add a whole new data set right into our chart, which is pretty cool in my opinion. Okay, this is looking pretty good, but it's always a good idea to add some color so we get some differentiation between our series of data. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to do that by creating a const colors array, which is going to be a string array, and this will contain some colors. And I already have some that I have copied. I'm just going to paste in here. These are just colors that I just kind of arbitrarily chose. It can be any CSS color that you would like. But once you have this array of colors, what we can do is we can basically say for the first data set, use this color. For the second data set, use this color, etc. And then when you run out of colors, loop back around and use the first one again. So the way we can do that is down here when we're creating our data set, we can set our background color to equal colors of, and then we need a counter. So let's wrap this and add a second argument up above in our map function to get that counter. And we can say I modulus colors.length. And we'll do the exact same thing with the border color. Cool. So hopefully when that refreshes, we can click on refresh here and you'll see you get some nice colors for each of these items. And then the same thing over here on our remote workbench. If we give that a refresh, Let's click here. It's going to reload all of that data with our nice new colors. And you'll see it goes from blue to sort of this magenta, and then it goes back to blue, green, teal once again. So it's just kind of looping around. Okay, so this is working pretty well at this point. We've actually loaded some real SharePoint data into our Chart.js visualization. We're visualizing this data and creating a whole new way to interact with and consume our list data that we have in our SharePoint environment. We do have one big problem, however. The issue is that we have hard-coded all of the column names or the field names that we're using on our list. So earnings Q1, Q2, the title, all of that stuff has been hard-coded into this web part. Also, we've hard-coded the labels and the colors into this web part as well. And not only that, but way up here in our get list items method, we've hard-coded the list ID. So if you wanted to reuse this web part in any other area of your SharePoint site on a different list with different data, we would have to completely build a new web part for that purpose. And of course, that's not going to be the ideal solution. What we really want is a web part that is configurable and can be reused in a lot of different cases. And we're going to learn how to do that in the very next lesson.